Good morning, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for being with us this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce Kuldeep Singh Rajput. Kuldeep is the CEO and founder of Biofourmis, a fast-growing digital health company that's to augment personalized healthcare and empower people with complex chronic conditions to live better and healthier lives. Kuldeep has been featured in 30 Under 30 for his strong leadership experience. He's built teams, developing talent, successfully growing and managing strategic partnerships with global pharmaceuticals and health systems. Biofourmis has raised over 45 million US dollars in venture capital from leading VCs like Mass Mutual Ventures, Singapore's own ADBI, Aviva, and Mayo Clinic Ventures. His background is in biomedical engineering and data, and he holds a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm not sure if I've forgotten anything, Kuldeep, but you can take it away and set the record straight.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure being here. Today, I'm going to essentially, talk a little bit more about what we do at Biofourmis and, with the COVID pandemic, how we have been essentially able to, combat COVID-19 and help, manage patients in a much better fashion. To give you a little bit, introduction about, Biofourmis. I started the company end of 2015, and Biofourmis started with a dream, and the dream was, can we predict disease before it happens so that we can improve health and outcomes? Every one of us knows a loved one, directly, indirectly, who has suffered from a chronic condition. Would it be beneficial if we could have predicted that earlier? And that's what has really driven us for all these years. So our mission at Biofourmis really is, how do you empower people with complex chronic conditions to live healthier and better lives by really being able to deliver precise intervention at the right time. To give you a little bit of a context, and the way we do that is we are really moving towards managing patients beyond the pill. If you look at 1900s, started with small molecules, there was biologics, gene therapy, and there's a whole new class of medicine which has emerged since 2019, which is, how do you combine a known pharmaceutical therapy and augment that with a digital solution to better manage patients with complex chronic conditions? To give you an overview about Biofourmis by numbers, we have built a single platform, what we call as BioVitals for therapeutic decision-making, primarily focused on three broad therapeutic areas: cardiometabolic, respiratory, and oncology. We take regulatory and quality systems very seriously. We go through strict regulatory clearances and follow that whole approach of pharmaceutical drug development, even in our software products. We have 3 FDA authorizations by the FDA and multiple approvals in various countries outside the US, including Europe, Australia, and Asian countries. We are 120 full-time employees globally, headquartered in Boston, but offices in Singapore, Zurich, and India. In the past 6 months, we were fortunate. We acquired 3 companies, BioVotion, a wearable sensor company, Guido, which we recently announced to get into or expand our pipeline in oncology, a digital therapeutics company based out of LA, and Hashtag to expand our software development team based out of India. We have raised altogether 45 million in venture financing, and we work with a variety of strategic partners and customers, all the way from large pharmaceutical companies to large health systems in Asia and the US. So just to give you a little bit overview about what BioVitals does. So we have built a platform, a full stack software platform called BioVitals, which essentially has 3 main key pillars to it. The first one is patient-facing tools, which has the ability really to capture passive data from sensors and active data using patient companion app. When we started the company, we said we wanted to be device agnostic. So we integrated over 20 plus FDA cleared wearables onto a platform, all the way from patches to wrist-worn devices, armbands. And the thesis really was not to flood patients with multiple sensors, have single sensor which patients wear on their body, forget about it, and we are still able to capture all relevant biomarkers. And from a patient companion app, we have built a variety of feature set, and depending on the use case, the therapeutic area, we plug and play the right features. And these include things like medication management, education and content, communication between caregiver, patient, PROs, etc. The second key pillar of our platform is an analytics engine, which has over 200 modules. But to put it in a very simple way, it does two things. One is it has the ability to take these active passive data and have the ability to predict decompensation in patients ahead of a critical event. And second is we have built treatment algorithms for different diseases to optimize therapy, essentially the right optimal dosage for the right patient at the right time, and finally integrate that into the clinical care pathways, which is a third pillar, by providing the right tools for nurses and clinicians to manage. And using this platform, we wrap it up into our digital therapeutic solution across different disease areas. And just to give you an example, I thought it might be worthwhile to talk about one of our lead product, which is for patients with heart failure. And if you look at the key pain point in patients with heart failure, it's the number one cause for hospitalization with patients over 65 years. 25% of patients get hospitalized within 30 days after discharge. And one of the biggest clinical unmet need is less than 1% of patients with heart failure are on optimal dosage, and less than 20% of them receive guideline-directed therapy. And that's when we built our platform called as BioVitals HF. It's a clinical decision support tool for managing patients with heart failure. It's a 12 weeks program, and again has those three key critical components into the platform, starting with patient-facing tools, where patient goes home with a sensor along with the patient-facing companion app. And the patient essentially is using the sensor called Averion, which they wear on their upper arm, captures around 15 plus different physiological parameters continuously in real time. And the patient-facing app engages the patient all the way from managing their medication, symptoms, communication between caregiver, patient, personalized content, and education. All that data goes to our FDA cleared BioVitals analytics engine, which essentially does two things. One is it has the ability to detect these subtle physiology changes and heart failure exacerbation ahead of a critical event, and then use our treatment algorithms to optimize therapy and optimize dosage, which eventually gets transmitted to a clinical care dashboard for clinicians to manage, intervene, and review. So if you look at the whole core value proposition of BioVitals HF, it starts with all the way from continuous monitoring, early detection of exacerbation, followed by optimization of heart failure therapies, and eventually how do you really drive that health economic benefits and the cost savings. And for every product we really build, we run through a rigorous clinical validation to test it out. So just to give you some clinical results, starting with, on the left-hand side, you see a study which was done with over 1,000 patients, a randomized study where, the control arm was actually led by a navigator-led program, which consisted of pharmacies, nurse practitioners, and heart failure cardiologists to be really able to optimize dosage and therapy by remotely monitoring patients. And if you look at the data, for all the heart failure medication, patients who were on the navigator-led program had significant increase in guideline-directed therapy, as well as were eventually optimized to optimal dosage in a matter of 3 months, and compared to the usual care where there was absolutely no difference in patients at the point of discharge and after 3 months. We then, of course, even validated the health economic benefits of the platform. And in this study, which was done at Brigham, recruited heart failure patients, but also respiratory patients, and patients were monitored back at home instead of monitoring in hospital. And the study really demonstrated almost 70% decrease in hospital readmission and overall 38% decrease in overall cost of care, a significant improvement in overall quality of life and physical activity in patients who were monitored back at home. So one of the things, what we have been able to do, and one of our business models really is working with channel partners and pharmaceuticals primarily. And we recently announced our major partnership with Novartis, where our product, BioVitals HF, is wrapped around existing pharmaceutical therapy for managing patients with heart failure with Entresto. So every patient essentially prescribed on Entresto in a patient support program gets prescribed BioVitals HF for monitoring them over a period of 90 days to really be able to predict those exacerbation and prevent those hospital readmission, but also be able to optimize therapy and put the patients on the right optimal dosage. So that's really what we do in heart failure. But to show you pipeline, what we have at Biofourmis, a very robust pipeline of digital therapies. And as you can see, we go have a specific development process all the way from translation to research. We run pilot studies, pre-submission to the FDA, pivotal trials, and eventually FDA authorization and commercialization. And from a strategy perspective, we have a platform approach where we have core analytics engine, which becomes part of our every single product, especially BioVitals, which is device agnostic. We have BioVitals Sentinel platform, which essentially is a disease agnostic remote monitoring platform. And then as you move down, you look at our cardiometabolic pipeline, as well as our pipeline in oncology and pain. So moving to what we are doing in this pandemic, right? When the whole COVID-19 broke, one of the very early days, in fact, end of January, we put together a platform for monitoring patients with COVID-19. And, first in February, we rolled out a program in Hong Kong, really to monitor two kinds of patients population. One, who are suspected and quarantined at home, to be able to detect those subtle changes ahead of a symptom, because in COVID-19 patients, once the patient gets infected, there's this incubation period of 7 to 8 days, only when they start showing up symptoms. And that's the duration when patients are infecting and when they are asymptomatic. And that's why you see a widespread amount of, increase in number of cases. So we have been actively rolling out our platform with the ministry and the governments in 5 different countries right now. By end of next month, we should have over 10,000 patients on our platform. Incredible amount of data, a lot of impact what we have been starting to see from patients. And this includes all the way from patients being monitored in quarantine facility, in the hospital, in isolation wards, community isolation center, as well as really being able to monitor healthcare staff. Because, in China, we saw a data which said 28% of all the COVID patients who were infected were healthcare workers and nurses. That's a huge problem. And really being able to monitor those healthcare professionals and detect those subtle changes ahead of a critical event. So in the platform, it had similar components all the way from, sensor to capture, COVID-related symptoms, all the way from your heart rate, your pulse oximetry, respiration rate, blood pulse wave, activity patterns, temperature, continuously using sensor. The mobile app was used to monitor symptoms level, record cough, and remotely communicate between the caregiver patient, processed by our analytics engine, which I'll show you some data and eventually integrate that into the clinical care pathways and dashboards for nurses and clinicians to remotely manage these patients instead of again and again going into the infected area or isolation rooms in the hospital to manage these patients. This is a data, preliminary analysis, which would be soon published from one of the studies on COVID positive patients. Small number of patients, 34. All these patients were hospitalized in the hospital due to severity of COVID-19, and all of them were infected cases. And this actually demonstrates the ability of the platform where we generated the BioVitals index, which is our risk profile, which was customized specifically for COVID-19, and correlated that with actual clinical events, all the way from your PCR test, blood results, any clinical events. And out of the whole 200 events which we had, the BioVitals platform demonstrated a sensitivity of around 95% and specificity of 87.5, really to be able to detect all those critical events and provide clinicians much better insights ahead of a critical event to be able to intervene. And one other interesting thing, what we saw from all these platforms being rolling out is ability of BioVitals to really be able to predict clinical status and the average length of the stay. And that's a huge benefit. If you look at the US, hospitals are getting overcrowded. Hospital systems are looking at strategies to, allocate proper hospital resources and provide care to patients who really require attention and care rather than overflooding it. And in this result, with an AUC of around 91%, we were able to use the first 3 days of hospital data, continuous physiological monitoring data, and be able to predict if the patient is going to worsen or if the patient is going to improve in the next days, and also predict the length of the stay. And that becomes critical because hospitals could then discharge these patients early enough and even provide home-based monitoring rather than occupying that bed and freeing that up for people and patients who really need attention. And we'll significantly have much more insights and data in the coming days. We have also been involved in one of the drug trials, which was done for COVID-19 by one of the pharma companies in phase 2, which was recently published with very impressive data in terms of being able to treat patients with COVID-19 in the hospital setting, and that data is already out, and we are rolling out phase 3 studies. So I'll probably stop there, open for questions, and thank you everyone for the opportunity.
Thank you for that presentation, Kuldeep. This is extremely interesting. In fact, I remember writing about Biofourmis when it first raised its seed round 4 years ago, and it's very cool to see where the company has been, what it has been getting on with. So congratulations. I will get to the audience questions because we have some really good ones coming in. And I want to start with, so in terms of doctors working with platforms like yours, how do you see the future relationship developing? So for somebody pursuing a medical degree right now, what would be your sort of advice for the digital future?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And what we have been seeing, not just in the US, but even internationally, two things, right? Even if unfortunately with COVID-19, the whole world has moved towards, managing patients remotely. In the US, we have again and again seen many hospital systems, imposing rules that they are going to exclusively manage all the, chronically ill patients outside hospital by using telemedicine and remote monitoring technologies. And we have seen the market speed up. I mean, even just for Biofourmis, getting government contracts with the ministries takes, a year. And we have been closing those in matter of couple of weeks or sometimes 30 days. And even with hospital systems, so the market has completely fast forwarded. But specifically for, let's say, whoever is training, I think, for medicine, digital is the way, patients are expecting they are going to be managed, because nobody wants to go to the old way of healthcare. Everyone wants to use this existing way, and it has worked very well. 80% of all the patients in the US are managed using digital tools right now. And I think this needs to be embedded into the education curriculum, even for um, you know, um, um, aspiring doctors, so that they learn how do you use digital tools and integrate that into the proper clinical care pathway, because it's no more a brick and mortar, or they're just learning about clinical science, but really understanding how do you use data to guide their clinical decision making, rather than really understanding from patient perspective and using those symptomatic data, instead using data-driven approach.
That is good advice, I gotta say. Going to another question, and this is a bit more specific. So when it comes to the BioVitals platform, obviously a lot of patients are going to be elderly people, going on in years. A lot of them might have difficulty using a digital system, using a smartphone, or in remembering they have to use a specific procedure. How can you address that?
Yeah, no, I think that has been one of our biggest priority, right? When we started the company, many remote monitoring. We are not a remote monitoring company, but we still have that, important piece in our solution. Flooding patients with multiple devices and asking them to proactively do it just doesn't work. I mean, we have seen that. You've seen multiple studies fail, and our thesis really from the beginning was, using a sensor to be able to capture passive data where patients wear and forget about it. Using a low-cost, non-sticky sensor, which has a great form factor, weighs probably even less than 10 grams, so patients don't even feel it. All our analysis and our outcomes data, which I just showed, is completely driven by passive data capture. Active data capture from the mobile app is, to engage the patient, but we have still seen, just with passive data, an adherence level of over 90-95% in patients over 65 years and above, because all the chronically ill patients we manage are over 65. And a significant high adherence level, and keeping the app as simple as possible, just as a gateway, because you need a gateway to transmit the data. And we will have our new version of the sensor, coming out, in Q3 this year, which would not even require an app and patients to do anything. They just strap on a device, and the data directly goes using GSM from the device to the cloud, and we are able to do all the outcomes and analysis and provide better care to the patient completely passively.
Automating as much of the process as possible. That's good thinking. On a bit of a different note, so Biofourmis and you yourself, you have been speaking to governments and regulators on how they can sort of better understand this environment. So do you see a sort of change in how governments are stepping up now with their public healthcare infrastructure?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we have seen and we have implemented in multiple countries, and I think governments are really stepping up. I think there are certain governments who understand, this pandemic much better and have taken proactive measures. There are some which haven't. Of course, many countries have implemented, social distancing apps and other things. But when it comes to real clinical care and how you're going to manage these patients at scale across the whole public sector in the country, I would say it's still disconnected, but they are trying to get there. I think in smaller countries like Singapore or Hong Kong, it becomes much more easier because you have few public hospitals. The ministry controls them, and it is easy for adoption as compared to countries like in the US or big countries like India, where the whole healthcare system is fragmented. And in the US right now, it's hospital by hospital and their own strategy rather than a government strategy.
Do you see a larger role for companies like Biofourmis to play? I guess in the new normal that we're seeing, for better or worse, the pandemic is redefining a lot of what we know about this stuff. So, how do you see your role and companies like yours?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the important things, and I was on a call just this morning with one of the leading hospitals in the U.S., and they have started implementing telemedicine since 3 months now. And we were on a call, and they were giving us feedback. Telemedicine video calls are great, but I don't, as a clinician, have data to make decisions. And that's where companies like us come into picture, where you're really being able to collect clinical data, not just your consumer grade sensors or consumer grade data, but clinical data from FDA approved sensors, FDA approved analytics engines, and platforms which can give clinicians much more clinical grade insights and actionable insights. That piece will keep growing because telemedicine combined with remote monitoring and digital therapies are going to scale. And of course, I think even for companies like ours, we have, of course, just with telemedicine, you have seen most of the public companies, their stocks go over the roof in a couple of months now. And, there is a huge interest from investor community. There's a huge interest from hospitals to adopt these technologies. And I think, if you would ask me in last year sometime, I would have said, maybe this is going to still take a few years until this scales. But today, even though hospital systems are adopting these technologies, one of the challenges we have seen is operationalizing this. The hospitals need operational capability to adopt such technologies. And of course, some are still getting there, some are ahead of time and ahead of curve. But I would see gradually the whole market completely moving there, with hospitals having the right infrastructure, but companies who really have clinical grade, regulatory approved products will see much more adoption as compared to consumer grade products.
Right. This is as good a place as any to wrap this up. I have so many more questions for you, and so does our audience, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So thank you once again, Kuldeep, for your insightful presentation, and thank you for answering our questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for the opportunity.